Hi, this will be a presentation on project-based learning, and it is based off of the 3 chapters from the book I listed on this slide. I would say this presentation is aimed more towards a teacher audience because it will contain a lot of advice on how to choose a project for your class, how to create it, and how to assess it. So basically, a summary of Chapter 3 would be how to choose learning objectives to focus on in the classroom that your project will be based off of. And I wrote down these 4 steps that are color coordinated to match with the info on the other slides. For example, this info would be explaining this step. And these 4 steps that I grouped from the readings will help you choose a project topic that will challenge your students and engage them. The first step I recommend doing is choose a complex idea for a project that will challenge students enough and will allow them to analyze, evaluate, and create. Step number 2 would be to connect the project to real-life situations so that the students can realize what is learned in a classroom can also be applied in other areas in the real world. I would also collaborate with other subject teachers to incorporate multiple subjects in a project. And here are 2 quotes from the book that perfectly explain why using real-life situations and collaborating with other teachers are important. So you guys can go ahead and read these. I really like this one because it connects to why should I care? Step 3 would be to encourage your students to have literacy skill with written materials and digitally as well. Staying up to date with technology in the classroom can be difficult because of how fast our world advances, but we can make opportunities for students to explore technology on their own instead of focusing on one particular resource in the classroom. We also need to encourage learning disposition by nurturing a growth mindset. Here are some words that describe what learning disposition is. And instead of saying compliments to students such as, "Good job, you're a smarty pants," say, "Wow, you're a hard worker," so that we can avoid students from having a fixed mindset that makes them think intelligence can't be worked on and is something you are born with. Step 4 would be asking yourself the so what question after making a project, and think of what a student would receive out of the assignment. So this would be making sure they take key takeaways that are clear enough for students to identify. This is where you can ask students to reflect on the project on a separate sheet of paper, and they can evaluate their own mindset, and the teacher can see where they're at also. We also need to make sure the project is exciting and allows the students to feel important. For example, when students feel like they're contributing to their current society, they tend to put more effort into their projects, usually understand the content better, and have a greater chance at remembering what they learned. The book uses the example of a physical science teacher creating a project about energy and discusses the forms of energy there are, such as the gas a stove runs on. This is where you can, now that we already know our important learning aims, we can start to design a project. Where to start? Even if you're planning to make a project completely of your own, it's good to gain ideas from projects that have been successful to branch off of those ideas, and to also identify methods to stay away from. Important things to keep in mind are to choose based on what would best benefit the students intellectually, and it's okay to be picky. Using critical thinking while reviewing projects can be a lot like the desired behavior you want to see from your own students when they complete the project you choose. The next slide will cover the specific details to watch out for to determine whether or not a project plan is acceptable. On this slide, I will be explaining the 6 potential pitfalls that the chapter explains. Something huge to watch out for is if the activity is long but is short in learning outcomes. We want the project to be quality and not quantity. We also need to make sure technology is being used purposefully and not being used as an alternative to handwriting work. Instead of considering typing an assignment on Google Docs and submitting it as technology incorporation, we need to allow students to instead use an application such as Leo Connect to interview alumni and then gain information on the student's dream career. Revolving class content on a theme is a habit that should be avoided because themes can lead teachers to settle on the surface and not dive deeper. The book mentions an example of using the theme oceans and assigning a project on drawing sea creatures. A more beneficial activity would be learning about how seafood ends up getting to the grocery store, and this still ties with the theme oceans. Complicated projects that have too many procedures should be avoided because they can lead to structured and limited outcomes. This next bullet point means that there aren't appropriate phases in the project where the teacher can stop at a good point to evaluate how students are doing or give struggling students advice to improve their final product. And lastly, we want to make sure the project relates to the real world. Something huge we need to keep in mind is to not choose a project that makes students replicate what other students have already done. This is because we need to allow them to explore on their own. They need to have room for their own interpretation and imagination, and feel eager to solve something that applies to their generation. The book talks about an example that a project that allows students to create their own political parties and post videos on YouTube to create community, instead of just reading about political parties from a textbook, for example. There were 14 bullet points mentioned in the book, but these are the ones that I think that are most important to consider as a teacher. I'll go ahead and pause so you can read each of them. Okay, I'm back. I wanted to elaborate on this bullet point right here. Maybe if your curriculum involves learning about sea animals, you can have students ask questions to a marine biologist that rescues animals so they can know what happens on the job. From there, they can also learn the specifics of how marine biologists take care of the animals they rescue, and you can even incorporate teaching the students about how climate change affects the animal's environment. I also like the have students learn by doing point because a lot of students are hands-on. Moving on to Chapter 5, this chapter talks about how to assess learning and provide support for students. And as I put in the parentheses, assessing student work isn't as easy as saying it's right or wrong, because a lot goes into a project. We need to help students understand what is expected of them in their performance, such as creating a rubric to establish a common understanding and basically get students on the same page as you. Below this phrase, the sentence, is a quote that explains exactly that. Creating a rubric basically helps students not have to figure out all the rules for 6 different teachers. The quote shows it's a great idea to communicate with other teachers so that each of them can aim to have similar expectations. Overall, this can help students execute their work better. 2 huge topics I want to talk about are assessment for learning and assessment of learning. They may seem like the same thing, but one of them helps students during the process of completing their work, and the other helps to evaluate work quality. Assessment for learning is assessing students' work during the process of completion instead of only assessing the final product of students' work. This means making students turn in several rough drafts of their work. When we only give feedback on the final product of a student's work, it's too late for a student to improve that specific piece. Assessment of learning measures students' learning in a summative way and evaluates the quality of the project so it can be even better next time. On this slide, I will be discussing how to help students gain the intended learning outcomes from a project you created, which is called summative assessment. I imitated this visual that I saw in the book that I really liked. And to evaluate whether students have grasped the outcomes you wanted them to get, start off with refreshing your mind of the purpose of the project. Then try to figure out what they would need to show in order to prove they learned, which would be the evidence part. Lastly, think of activities that would help struggling students get a clearer understanding. Activities can benefit everyone because humans learn better by doing. Since these 3 connect to each other in all directions, they don't necessarily need to be thought about in the particular order I explained. In this box right here are a few methods for assessment that I liked. A quiz can show how much your students know by asking them questions you'd want them to know answers to. A performance task I thought of doing was having students do a table rotation activity and me observing the students' interactions with the content. Rubrics are great for teachers to fill out, but you can also have students evaluate themselves through them. Many of my teachers have done this for their students, and this can help a teacher measure effort if a student thinks they tried their best in completing the assignment. Someone's best effort might be someone else's moderate effort, so this helps teachers avoid assessing students' work in the same way. Lastly, a student having to submit their work in a contest can motivate them to do their work at their best and encourages them to have discipline. This next slide will be talking about formative assessment, which is guiding students in meeting their needs to get to success. And success is helping them to understand the big ideas we planned the project around in the first place. The first bullet point I wrote down was to create a project timeline that will have scheduled check-ins and reflections as students work on their projects. Chunking work into steps also helps students pace themselves and not feel overwhelmed. For example, there have been many instances where teachers only give a due date for a project and expect all students to turn in quality work that is on time. Chunking work with checkpoints gives way better results because it reduces procrastination and includes direction from the teacher. Students are more likely to stay on track with their work and understand what they are doing. Publishing the checkpoints onto a class resource is a great way to enforce this. You can post reminders of due dates on Google Classroom, for example, and/or email the reminders to the students and parents so their parents can also help their children be on track with their work. The other important bullet point that I have on here is checking in with the individual student's progress and mentality. So this means making it clear that you are available, whether it is after class or at lunch, and remind your students that they can email you at any time with questions. Checking in on their mental health and their workload in other classes is also a suggestion that I would have because these things can affect the quality of a student's work. Yay! We have come to the end of my presentation, and other than my little tongue ties, I hope the information from the slides were helpful and you enjoyed watching. Thank you!